The way we nominate our presidents is the reason today we have Donald Trump facing off against someone even the Democrats don't really want, and that's Joe Biden.
You're listening to the USSC Briefing Room, a podcast from the United States Study Center at the University of Sydney, where we give you a seat at the table for a USSC briefing on the latest developments in U.S. news and foreign policy. We'll cover what you need to know and what's beneath the surface of the news.
Hello, I'm Jared Montre. I'm the Director of Research here at the U.S. Study Center, and welcome to another episode of USSC's Briefing Room. Today, we're going to talk about a number of political issues, especially around elections themselves and the way America does democracy, and maybe how it differs from Australia. And I have a great guest to speak on that. But before we get started, I first want to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. So we are in the final months of the election campaign. And one thing that we like to tell folks here is that, especially visiting folks here, is that the Australian thirst for U.S. political news and political developments is unquenchable. And in 2016, Australians consumed or searched for twice as much information on Google for the U.S. election as they did their own election that year. And it really is fascinating when I bring American visitors out to Australia. I like to tell them to assume that you're talking to a Washington, D.C. audience. They may not know Panera Bread, they may not know Chipotle, but they definitely know all the political players. And one person who knows both on the ground as well as the long-term issues in D.C. and in American politics in general is our guest today. Ray LaRaja is professor of political science at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst and a visiting fellow at the U.S. Study Center. He is also the director of the UMass Amherst poll, which does surveys of American voters. Ray is a fantastic and leading authority on the way that America does its election, the way that America campaigns, and so it's been a pleasure having him in Sydney with us. Now, one thing I want to get started on, Ray, is can you just confirm that you have a stat or figure ready to go at the end of this episode to share with our guests?
Oh yeah, of course I do. I know that's a tradition here. I do.
Thanks so much, Ray. Now, I'd love to hear what got you started in this, and you know, what is, we say that you do the UMass Amherst poll, but maybe explain like what exactly you do at UMass Amherst, and it's what does it survey of American voters?
Sure. So in addition to my role teaching here at UMass, I'm at a public university. We run a poll, a survey that does ask questions of the American public, the national public. And we do that periodically. We try to ask some more interesting questions. And we also do a poll in Massachusetts. I'm in the state of Massachusetts as a service to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And so that's something we do a couple of times a year. Sometimes politicians get upset about the findings, but we do it anyway.
And then in terms of your research areas that you focus on the most, you've published a number of books, you're about to publish another one. Could you maybe just give us an idea of what you work on?
Yeah, a lot of my work has to do with elections, but especially because America has so much money in their elections, I've been focusing on that for a lot of my career. I also write a lot about other types of election issues like primaries. I write about a little bit about gerrymandering, but it is largely focused on elections. I also look at some issues of representation in local politics here in the United States as well.
Can I ask what brought you out to Australia, and what did you do while you were out here?
So Australia was a fortunate circumstance. I'm on sabbatical, and I did some work in the fall, fortunately in a beautiful city called Paris. And I wanted to also get a sense for Australian politics to rub it up against what I've been observing in my close inspection of the United States. And I learned a lot just by talking to people, observing, reading the newspapers while I was working on this book. And it informs possibly a future project comparing U.S. and Australia.
Fantastic. So I guess one thing that I would venture to guess is that while you're out here, you did not hear about Australian political action committees or super PACs or gerrymandering. So maybe could you just explain? These are a lot of terms that Australians may hear about. I remember and Stephen Colbert, back before he had his own late night show, he started his own super PAC to just show how crazy the whole campaign finance system works. So could you maybe explain some of these terms we've heard, but also how, especially after spending some time here, the campaign finance system works differently than in Australia?
So politicians in the U.S. can get their money from three sources. One of them is from individual contributions to their campaigns. That's actually the biggest source. They can get it from the political parties, and they also get it from what we call political action committees, PACs. That's interest groups. But you mentioned the term super PAC. By the way, one thing I should say is we don't have public money, public financing the way you do in Australia with the political parties.
They've tried to have public financing,
They did
but
try.
it didn't really work, right?
It didn't work because the cost of the U.S. elections kept going up and up and up, and the money provided was not enough, and politicians sought different methods to get around the public financing system. By the way, the one who did not take public funding for the first time in an election was Barack Obama, because he didn't think he wanted to raise millions in order to compete. So super PACs are something that's one of those get around the system organizations. If in the United States, if you give money to a politician, it's limited because they're afraid of corruption. You're not supposed to give more than $5,000 as an interest group. Okay, quid pro quo. But super PACs, they say, okay, we're not going to give to the politician. We're going to spend money independently. You know, I like Jared. I'm going to say vote for Jared, but I'm not coordinating with him. I'm not even telling Jared, technically, that I'm supporting him. I'm just going to go out and spend it. And under those rules, independent spending, I can raise as much money as I want from millionaires, billionaires, and spend as much as I want. So there's no limits. Hence, we call them super PACs, and they're interest groups.
In terms of how that differs from Australia, I guess Australia, I know, has a shortened election campaign season, which I would say as an American seems a bit healthier to me because we're always campaigning in America. But in terms of the funding in Australia from what you learned here, are the numbers even close to equal?
No, not at all. I mean, on a per capita basis, the U.S. still spends so much more than Australia. Obviously, we're a larger country than the U.S., but it's not even close. And as you suggested, it's a lot of it is because people start running for office as soon as they get into office in this country, because we have fixed elections. In Australia, you call an election and it's underway and you campaign for several weeks and it's over. Not so here, where people can anticipate the date of an election. It's also larger constituencies, of course, and the cost of media in the United States is much, much higher. And also parties are weaker in the United States. In Australia, the parties throw a lot of their weight behind candidates and they can spend on their behalf. But here, it's more focused on the candidate. So each candidate has to help mobilize their own voters.
We keep hearing a lot about PACs and a lot about money and fundraising. But I have to ask you then, in the election thus far, we've heard how Biden was out raising money for compared to Trump, and then Trump had a big showing, after he was recently convicted. What difference does the money make ultimately? A lot of times the horse race politics gets into literally just like fundraising disclosures and, they raise more, they raise less. Do you think it makes a big difference? Should we be paying attention to that in the U.S. election?
So that's the funny thing, is that we all suspect it makes a difference, because why would these politicians be running around trying to get so much money? The question is, where does it make a difference and how much? And it's really hard to figure that out. I will say that it probably makes less of a difference in presidential elections. Why is that? Because the presidential candidates get so much attention. We call it free media. And so they're being followed around and voters get information that way. Where the presidential money makes a difference, though, and this has to do with, more, not running the TV ads so much as mobilizing voters who normally would not turn out. And here's a difference with Australia. There's no compulsory voting in the United States. That means parties and candidates have to knock on doors and get people to vote, okay? So it's another reason costs in the United States are higher. We have to spend on mobilizing voters. As you go down ballot, the House elections, the U.S. House elections, state legislatures, money actually makes more of a difference there because people don't get as much information about them. So if you really want to, if you're a millionaire and you want to really impact a race, you should do it for, Congress, the House races, and state legislatures. And some of them, in fact, do that.
Or if you're a North Dakota governor who doesn't have very much name recognition, you can offer gift cards for any small donations in order to qualify for the debate stage, which I believe is exactly what Doug Burgum did. And now he's a VP finalist because he was on that debate stage. So, and it was remarkable to me. That was completely legal. If I remember correctly, he said, give me $1 and I'll give you a $25 gift voucher. Is that correct?
Yeah, he had a system where he was trying to incentivize people to give him small donations. And the curious thing about small donations, you really have to, the ones who are successful at it, like Trump, Donald Trump is probably the most successful small donor fundraiser in the U.S., is that you have to have some notoriety. You have to have some name recognition. And this, North Dakota, the governor didn't have much name recognition. This is one of the smallest states in the country. So he tried this gimmick, and apparently it worked.
But it seems like it's cash for votes, almost cash. But I guess that because it's not a federal election, that was completely legal. It's only a party election, and for that for that nomination, is that right? Is that why it was completely allowed?
Well, I'm not. That's not so clear actually, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more follow up on that. And one reason is we don't have, like the Australian Election Commission, the Federal Election Commission, the U.S. is very weak and not good at enforcing these. Because I think you could have challenged that, because you're right, in federal law in the U.S., you're not supposed to give something of value to a voter. And this sounds like something of value. Maybe that you could split hairs and say that it was an exchange, but the voter was actually giving more back to the candidate.
Yeah, but I want to follow up on something you said previously on the small donors. It seems like you said, Trump has been dominating the small donors, and then Biden has been doing bigger and better with the corporates. Maybe Trump is trying to now get more finance folks on side, it seems like in recent months. But what do you attribute that small donor passion for? And what do you think that is indicative of? You gave a great presentation at the U.S. Study Center on small donors and how they've evolved. But I'd love maybe you can summarize it for our listeners.
Sure. So, small donors are seen as a possible antidote to the big money in politics. And so that's very, popular as trying to stimulate more small donors. The way small donors work often, though, they tend to be the most partisan and the most ideological relative to the rest of American voters. So they're not the typical American. And what does that mean in a country that's polarized like ours? If you want to get small donations, you say polarizing things, and that attracts money. And who's great at doing that? That's Donald Trump. And some other members of the U.S. Congress, some of your listeners might know, like Marjorie Taylor Greene, the House member from Georgia who is spouting conspiracy theories, trying to depose House speakers. And every time she does something like that, she gets money from all over the country in small donations. So it's a double-edged sword in the sense that, yes, it's in small amounts that are not corrupting, but it's also from highly ideological donors who are giving to people oftentimes who are very polarizing. So
it seems like Marjorie Taylor Greene maybe isn't engaging in political action committees as much, or super PACs, because she goes for the viral video and then and gets the donations, like you said, from all over the country. But what does it actually look like then for these political action committees or PACs or super PACs, how do they coordinate or essentially coordinate, but not legally coordinate with campaigns? What does that look like in practice?
Yeah. What they do, the Supreme Court has said, so long as you don't coordinate again, you can spend as much as you want. The campaigns and the super PACs and other independent groups have come up with a system where they technically do not coordinate, but they share information about what's going on. And so the campaign might put on its website, we really feel that women who are over 50 and are very concerned about having access to abortion in Midwestern states are really going to be concerned. And we're going to put a lot of ads on these 3 counties in these states. And so the super PAC consultant sees that and they say, okay, we're going to double down and help these folks. We're going to put our money targeted to these folks. So technically the whole public knows about it. So it's not an inside coordination, but it really is in practice coordination, which gets around the spirit of the rules.
And I believe you call it red boxing. Is that the term?
Red boxing, yeah. There's a part in the web that shows exactly where to highlight their strategies.
I'll never forget Ted Cruz doing that in 2016, and he had sort of unlisted YouTube videos that I guess he had a link to on his website somehow, but he would have unlisted YouTube videos, so you couldn't find them organically on YouTube, but you if you had the URL, you could see them, and it was hours of tape of him sitting next to random family members, all glowing about him in different ways. But what was awkward about it is that it wasn't like a one take, let's give me 10 minutes with my nephew who I've taken care of. It's like literally like an hour of different ways talking about the same thing. And it was so awkward and bizarre to see a man just sit there and have people praise him in so many different ways. But it makes sense if you are then cutting ads for Ted Cruz because you're a super PAC, and you want to have different views, different angles, and different sound bites. But it was a bit weird to see, to be frank with you.
The U.S., we're known for having a lot of tech innovation, but the way we do these innovations in campaigns is no less crazy, many respects, because the Federal Election Commission doesn't enforce a lot of these things. They're willing to push the limits on different ways of getting money through the system. And I should say on the flip side that many of the reformers are often unrealistic about how much money it takes to run elections in this country. And they sometimes clamp down too much, which encourages, money's like water. It needs someplace to go, especially in the United States, where the Supreme Court says you can't stop how much people can spend on politics. Very different from Australia and other countries in Europe. There's no limits on how much people can spend. So a billionaire can spend as much as they want without limit. I'm
glad you brought up the FEC in the U.S. Because, as you said, it's you could say paralyzed by the political division between Democrats and Republicans leading it. And I think that the latest is that they've refused to come out with any regulations on AI and the use of AI in advertisements. I mean, it was the FEC that I believe that required politicians to say at the end of their advertisements, my name is so-and-so and I approve this message, I believe. So they got that much. But in terms of requiring any disclosure that AI was used, if I want to make up some AI voice of my opponent and say the worst things possible, right now, there's no need to disclose that it's not factually accurate. Do you see this as being par for the course and the FEC just refusing to take on more reforms? Or do you see slow reforms over time?
Yeah, it's a good question. And what happens in the U.S. is usually there's a scandal, and this is true in other countries, and then there's a spurt of reforms, and then there's a long period of quiescence as politicians figure it out and then figure out how to break the rules a little bit. But in the U.S., the period of quiescence is going to be even longer. And why is that? Because not only is the Federal Election Commission in gridlock, Congress is in gridlock, especially on anything that has to do with election laws. And they would be the ones to say, okay, you have to limit or advertise that you're using AI. And I don't think Congress can get any agreement on that. Anytime there's any issue that has to do with elections, it becomes completely partisan. Who's going to benefit? Who's going to be hurt? I don't see that changing for a while.
When do you say would you point to as the last period of major electoral reform where people were able to get anything done?
That was back in 2001, 2002, when they passed these reforms called the McCain-Feingold Act, which limited how much political parties can raise and spend. And they changed a few other features. Because the parties were no longer as active, they let politicians raise additional funds. I actually was not crazy about that reform because I suspected what would happen was this money would flow to interest groups instead. And we'd get things like super PACs, and that's in fact what has happened. That we now have groups that have these strange names like Americans for a Better America. We don't know who they are. And they spend as much as they want, and we have no accountability.
Was this the McCain-Feingold that also brought in public spending for presidential campaigns?
That goes further back post-Watergate. So that was in Watergate, after the scandal of the Nixon administration, they thought about using public funding in congressional elections. That was nixed in Congress. They did vote for that, but they did say for presidential elections. And that worked for a while. And then, as I mentioned earlier, elections became incredibly expensive. And the rule, if you accept public funds, you agree not to spend anymore. Well, most politicians who had any chance of winning said, well, we'd just as soon raise tons of money than go into this public financing system. So that's no longer in practice.
Got it. So seems like the era of reforms are not only at least 2 decades old, but probably only going to get further away. But I guess one question then is, if you had a magic wand, what sort of reforms do you think are necessary? Obviously, with the caveat that I don't think compulsory voting is likely anytime soon. But you had some time in Australia. What are your thoughts on some reforms that the U.S. should consider, and the sort of reforms that may actually be likely to take place?
Well, I agree that compulsory voting is unlike the United States, although I think it's something that is very helpful in tamping down on polarization and campaign costs. So I would like to see some states in the United States experiment with universal voting. And it would seem fair because we wouldn't spend so much time arguing about the election laws. We'd have a commission like the Australian Election Commission that would spend its time making sure people could vote easily. So I still won't give up on that one. I like that one. In terms of money in politics, I like the idea of putting more responsibility on the political parties. Why is that? Political parties are known entities. They have an incentive to win elections, which means they're going to invest the money in the candidates who they think are going to win in places that are supposedly competitive. Right now, it's a free-for-all with interest groups spending money in races, especially in primaries, and supporting candidates who are more extreme than even your basic rank and file partisan in either party. And I think there would be less of that if I've talked about this in one of my previous books called "When Purists Prevail: Campaign Finance." And if you want the purists to win out, you let them control the money rather than the party organizations, which are made up more of professionals. So that's another one. And then in terms of other reforms, gerrymandering is an issue where politicians carve up the districts to, make sure they keep getting reelected, and helps their party. Some states have begun to experiment with independent electoral commissions. The Australian Electoral Commission has a very good reputation for creating districts, and I think that's a reform we could adopt here in the United States that would definitely improve our politics. And then, of course, improving the enforcement that the Australian Election Commission is well known for.
Great. And I guess you talked about how Congress is in gridlock. One thing that I've noticed is a fellow political scientist at UCLA named Lynn Vavrick has written about calcification and how, despite so many events going on over the last few decades, the parties and their policy platforms haven't really moved, and people sort of rigid and where they are. And I think it seems like because they're so rigid and because it's so 50-50, literally the Senate is closer than ever, like one election after another. It seems like parties are just trying to eke out small wins in the actual electoral process itself. What are the sort of things that you think that you're most focused on in terms of the ways that the parties are trying to just change the electoral process itself to eke out a few more wins? Or what do you pay the most attention to?
So you're right that the parties do focus on just this very handful of close seats, and they try to divide the electorate in ways that favor their side. Whether the Democrats are going to talk about abortion, and they're going to make sure that more people, highly supportive, especially women in suburbs, come out and give them just that amount to win the presidential and some Senate races. And the Republicans likewise will focus on things like immigration that they think will turn out their base. The problem is neither party is really looking to build a larger coalition, which would mean moving towards more of the center, in my view, rather than mobilizing the base. That's one reason I like compulsory voting. There'll be more people who are in the center. Not perfectly in the center. They'll have mixed issues, but I like cross-pressured voters, and I think that makes for less polarized politics. So a few things have to happen before the parties start rethinking it. One is one party really needs to lose badly in a presidential election, really badly. And I thought that might have happened in 2016 with Trump, but obviously I was wrong. Now 2020, it's a very close election. But if one of the candidates loses pretty badly, that party, the losing party, usually rethinks their strategy a bit. And that opens up space for trying to build a larger coalition. Will the parties do it? It's always, it remains to be seen. But the other thing is people die off. I mean, the older generations die off. They have certain likes and dislikes. And then a new generation moves in. The parties have to kind of appeal to them. And that creates new openings for entrepreneurial politicians. And that's another way that politics might shift.
I think in 2012, the party did lose pretty resoundingly. And that was Mitt Romney and the Republicans losing to Barack Obama. But then the Republicans, when they did what they called the postmortem, and they talked about all the reforms they want to do to get more urban voters, get more non-white voters, they had a very interesting take on where the Republican Party should move. And then they, 4 years later, nominated Donald Trump to be their nominee. But with that said, I think the party elites weren't a big fan of that. The party elites who wrote that postmortem, and that was a sort of a grassroots thing with Donald Trump. Didn't matter how many times the Republican Party didn't want Donald Trump, or made clear they didn't want Donald Trump to be their nominee. They went ahead and did it. So I think that's the U.S. system, you could say, is and the primary system is more democratic than other systems that have more party input. I don't think a Donald Trump type character could ever lead one of the major parties in Australia. Would you agree with that after spending some time here?
I have to say, that is a really important point. I couldn't say it more. The way we nominate our presidents is the reason today we have Donald Trump facing off against someone even the Democrats don't really want, and that's Joe Biden. I blame the primary nomination system for much of the problems we're having right now in U.S. politics. It is largely uncoordinated now. You have to be, a media celebrity or very rich. it's not representative of the American voters. You could win with a plurality of a strong base. So this is where it comes back to my earlier point about strengthening the political parties. Though back in the day, for those who read American history, there used to be conventions where party leaders would get together and they would basically agree on the candidate who's the least offensive to different regions, different groups in the party. And that sometimes would be a boring person, but sometimes it turned out to be someone like Abraham Lincoln. So it really, but the bottom line, it was more representative of groups. Of course, holding in abeyance the fact that part of our population, African Americans, weren't represented at all until the 1960s. So that system, for all its faults, people call the parties corrupt, created greater certainty and greater representation. And now it's more of a free-for-all. And that's why a demagogue could come in and basically capture the party and then use that as a vehicle for his own personal gain.
It's been fantastic chat, Ray. Thank you so much. Before we close up, just wanted to ask, do you have a stat or figure that you want to share with us today?
Sure. So one of the things I've learned from doing this research on U.S. small donors is in the last 2 years especially, they've surged even in congressional elections. So half the donations now, so it's not PACs, it's not rich people that are going to congressional candidates, are from small donors. When I mean small donors, money less than $200. That's something that a lot of people can afford. So in that sense, it's a good sign. These people look more like the rest of us. But again, as I said at the outset, they are more ideological and partisan. So there's a double-edged sword there. So half the donors are small donors.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for this great conversation, Ray. And thank you for spending some time with us in Sydney and sharing your fantastic insights with us at the Study Center. Ray, I love how prolific you are. As we wrap up, I just want to point out a couple of other podcasts that may be of interest. Our CEO, Mike Green, is co-host of the Asia Chessboard podcast with Jude Blanchette, Permanent Chair for China Studies at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. I also want to recommend checking out the USSC Live podcast series that runs recordings from our major live events, including our 2024 Election Watch Kickoff. You can find these on our website, ussc.edu.au, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks so much.